Willow. Hey there. Say hi. Watch to the end of this video for some additional comments. I know some people looking at this are saying you're focusing a lot on mite counts right now. What about non-reproductive mites as far as VSH and varroa sensitivity are concerned? And I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so for our test colonies, here are the final thoughts for the year. And it took me a little while to think over this as I looked at the mite counts and I thought over all of these colonies. Mite levels were up on most colonies, and not a surprise there. These had not been treated. Things like that just going to continue to build. Nearby colonies affect them, especially if they're not being treated with anything. Going forward, there's a number of these colonies that we're going to track into the spring to do some more UBO, but I don't know that it's going to be a larger group. I think we're going to keep with what we have been doing, in that our breeder or potential queen breeding colonies will be tested and not treated, so we can see how they do, to select for different characteristics for our production colonies. Production colonies are probably going to continue to get organic treatments and not go through this kind of a testing. So the focus is on the breeder colonies only. This did help reveal a few things and helps us think as we go forward in terms of what we want to blend our genetics with and what we want to put into drone yards. So again, just to review, as a group, the Harbo UBO in August was 64% average, Purdue was 46, Randy Oliver 15, Pauline 28, control was 10. Mites in August average, Harbo 2.3, Purdue 0.8, Randy Oliver 0.5, Pauline 0.3, control 1.5. September, Harbo was 2.3, average, Purdue was 6.3, Randy Oliver 5.3, Pauline 8.3, control 4.8. And you'll remember that a couple of colonies got pulled out and treated, so we did not count them in the October averages. Harbo in October 9.3, Purdue 12.3, Randy Oliver 7, Pauline 7, control 12.8. And again, the weights average in October, Harbo 77, Purdue 76, Randy Oliver 91, Pauline 98, control 94. So a couple of things. Purdue mite biters, some people might like them. They're not for me. Hopefully those colonies survive the winter. They will be requeened. Harbo number 1, because of how it did with mites, would be interesting to test. And it did okay on weight, but the temperament has not been great. So we're going to wait and see how they are in the spring. If that temperament is the same as it is right now in terms of being testy, that will go away. Harbo number 5 was the one we talked about before, that had a mite levels of 6 in August, and then 8 a couple weeks later, then back to 5, then to 7. So we would like to do a UBO on that in the spring, but it did weigh out at 79 pounds. So it's not in the horrible like 60-pound range. I'd like to see more, but we'll test that one. Harbo is still under consideration as far as drone yards. Don't love the weights, and if we're getting any temperament like that, don't love that, but we will continue to monitor that in the spring. Pauline number 12 did fairly well overall, so we'll test it for UBO in the spring. The Randy Oliver colonies were fairly productive, less so. The average was 91 because of 2 colonies. 2 were kind of light, but they are very calm and reasonable on mites, so they are good candidates for drone yards. Pauline were extremely productive across the board and fairly calm. Some other things to note. We know this already, but just to point out, colony with a 10 in August or in September, while mites are really ramping up. So you could easily see a higher count even if you treated it looking in October. Went from a 10 to a 3 when it got to forming. Also, want to point out, we saw this on a number of colonies. They were zeros or ones in September. If you just tested in mid to late September, you may think you're home free, the levels are 0. Some of those the colonies were as high as 12, 10, 11, and 12 by this point in October. So you can't trust a 0 or 1 in September necessarily, if that's all you're basing things on. My VSH Carney line still does well. We're still happy with that. We're going to keep that, probably blend it with, we'll see what happens in the spring. We have to go through the winter here yet, but we'll probably be blending it with Pauline and Randy Oliver. The way it looks right now, we'll evaluate the Harbo more in the spring. Again, the big test is yet to come. They have to make it through the winter. So we'll keep you posted on those colonies. Maybe midwinter if we get time to do a check there. Definitely gonna check some of those light Purdue mite biters. Would like to at least keep the bees there so that they don't completely die out. And then we'll see who makes it through to the spring and what they look like. Okay, so I wanted to add to the end of this video because I want to explain some things better that maybe I haven't explained well, and just to add a little bit more detail. So I know that not everyone agrees with my approach, and that's okay. And I know there's different ends of the spectrum. I know there are people who believe in, by the way, VSH is not, which is varroa sensitive hygiene, is not really the only resistant varroa trait or way of combating it. In fact, there's a lot that we really don't know yet. Still a lot is being learned. But by VSH, usually people are talking about some kind of mechanism by which the bees are able to cope better with varroa mites. And often it's tied to something that's called SMR, which refers to mites being reproductive. In other words, the idea behind it is if you have mites, but they can't reproduce, then they don't become that big of a problem eventually. And so there are people who don't really believe varroa resistance is a thing on one end of the spectrum. There are also people who believe very strongly in varroa resistance, who actually only look at reproductive mites, don't do mite counts. There's different ends of the spectrum. So what I'm doing, so first of all, a couple of points of clarification. When I say I'm pulling colonies from the group, it means that I'm going to treat them. And I know that some people would wait till maybe 5% mite infestation to treat, or some people would let them go altogether. We had just initially chosen what's considered a standard economic threshold of 3%, which is 9 mites showing up in a mite check if we do an alcohol wash. And so anything more than 9, we decided those are going to be treated. Now, I've already shared with you some feedback about the different genetics that we looked at. And winter is the final test, as I mentioned. We'll see how things go. At this point, I probably will pull the Purdue mite biters completely out of the group. In other words, get rid of those queens. However, I'll make that final determination in the spring. We'll see how things go. And it's not because of the level of mites, it's other aspects, as I explained at the beginning of this. If we had bees that were way too nasty, I didn't care what I was going to see. If we have bees that don't produce enough honey, and I know people disagree on this as well, there are some people that will not use honey production as a variable at all. It's something that we are using. If anything, it's that colony size, the way the brood looks, and honey production that will cause them to be removed, unless something changes between now and spring. So the ones that got treated, that got pulled for now, meaning that they got treated, those we will still look at, because I recognize as part of VSH, you can have a high mite level for a number of reasons, especially this time of year. You can have colonies collapsing nearby, and because your bees are healthy, they're robbing them out, and they get those mites. Or you can have a colony that collapses, and then those bees with their mites join your colony. That can artificially increase your mite load. And ultimately with VSH, the idea is like how well they can handle it. Now, there are not, VSH and Varroa sensitivity does not mean like super bees where you can just throw tons and tons of mites at them and they can continue to handle it. I think there's a point at which they can be overwhelmed, even very good genetics like that. So we will look at the UBO in the spring, and any that are performing well as far as the other aspects that we've described. We'll do the Harbo assay on them as well to see how things are in August as far as reproductive versus non-reproductive mites. And again, just continually informing what we're seeing as part of adding things to our breeding program and our drone yard program. So both are impacting breeding, both queens and drone side of the equation. But going forward, the focus is going to be on drone and queen breeding stock, not necessarily a large sample of 20, because a lot of our queen breeding stock, the majority of it does come from existing well-known programs. These are already being tested with Harbo scores, with mite counts, with all of the ways to evaluate Varroa sensitivity, for hygienic activity, VSH. Some people, when they're testing, will use just one or the other. Can think of, probably most people are familiar with Randy Oliver, and he uses mite counts solely. And based on what I'm seeing is he's probably got some bees that are able to handle the mites, and he's using a different approach. There are others who use just Harbo assays, which is just looking at on-capping brood to look for reproductive mites. And they're using that only, and they aren't even doing mite washes to determine how those genetics are performing. And I can respect different approaches, but there are others who will use a combination of approach. For example, Adam Finkelstein down at VP Queen Bees in South Carolina, that's been their approach. Both, they've used things such as the freeze brood, where you freeze the brood to see how hygienic the bees are, combined with mite counts. And so we're doing a combination of UBO, mite counts, and Harbo assays. Not everyone agrees with me, but I think mite counts can be really helpful. It informs you, first of all, to, if you're treating your bees, to know if the treatments are working, but it also helps you know what the mite pressure is. If I don't do any mite counts and I just do Harbo assays, I may assume that I have awesome genetics when I just happen upon a year or a location that has very low mite pressure. I wouldn't know that otherwise. So that's really the reason for this approach, why we chose this approach. And our goal is really just overall hygienic, good performing genetics, good queens. Hopefully reduced mite treatments, as we've seen with a lot of our stock. But I want tolerable and as far as gentle stock. I want very good honey production. So I'm trying to combine a number of these traits, and often low swarming goes along with honey production as well. So I might not get production colonies that don't need organic treatments, but if they don't need a lot of treatments and they respond well to organic treatments and they're overall very healthy, productive bees, that's a good outcome. So I wanted to just clarify as we're wrapping up this project for this time in the winter. We'll give some updates on how the colonies are doing over the winter. I hope the end here of your bee season, really kind of the start of the next year right now as we prepare colonies for next year, is going well. And I hope you found this interesting as we've continued to learn and kind of rediscover some things and just reaffirm some things during this process.